The sun was falling like a shot burr behind the low roofs of Cinder Creek, turning the prairie to hammered copper. Dust hung in the street, fine as flour, caught in the last light. From the open saloon doors came a tatty thread of piano, laughter that sounded like breaking glass, and the steady clink of spurs crossing creaking floors. Someone hauled open the side yard gate, and the crowd shifted, boots scuffing, as the auctioneer climbed the plank platform and tipped his hat. "Evening, folks," he called, voice slick as lamp oil. "We got one more lot before the coyotes start their hymn." The coyotes were already talking, faint and lonesome beyond town, a sound that made the hair at the nape go tight. Two men shoved a young woman up the steps. She wore a calico dress gone gray with road dust and dark at the hem, a shawl bound around her waist like a tourniquet. In the crook of one arm lay a swaddled bundle that bleated once, then fell to hiccuping silence. She stumbled. The plank groaned under her weight, and the auctioneer's smile never faltered. "Name's Rosalie. No last anyone cares a claim," he said. "A hard worker, if you can get her to it, with a free mouth to feed." A finger flicked at the infant. "We start at $10. A snigger rolled through the crowd. "10 too many," someone said. "Let me see the face." Another called, a gambler with a velvet waistcoat gone to grease. "Can't buy a stray with the sack on." The woman tried to turn away, chin tucked to the baby's downy head, but Big Hand caught her jaw and tilted it toward the light. Her lips were colorless. A strand of hair stuck to her brow with sweat. Blood, no more than a blush on the dust, dried in a crescent along her ankle. She blinked slow, like every breath cost her. Elias McKenna stood near the water trough, hat brim shadowing his eyes. He looked like any other rancher, sun-bitten, shoulders square from years on a saddle, but something in his stillness set him apart. Men who worked cattle learned to be quiet the way a hawk learned wind. His spurs didn't jingle because he didn't shift. He watched Rosalie without blinking, watched the baby's blanket ripple with each tiny breath, watched the way she braced her knees, as if she could hold the world back with nothing but will. 10, the gambler said, lazy as a yawn. 11 came from a drover with a red kerchief and a voice like a rasp. The auctioneer's gavel tapped a little rhythm. 11, I hear. Do I have 12 for the lady and accessory? A thin man with a lopsided mustache grinned, teeth the color of old ivory. What if we want just a woman? A ripple of ugly laughter. Someone in the back said, take the brat to the mission. They'll find a pail for it. A bottle fell in the saloon and shattered. The piano played on, unbothered. Please, Rosalie whispered. It was more breath than sound. Please don't. The gambler leaned in so close she could smell the whiskey past his pomade. Hush, sugar. Men are speaking. Elias's jaw ticked. He took his hat off, slow, as if the air had gotten too tight beneath it. The late sun threw a thin line of fire along the brim. He didn't move toward the platform yet, but his gaze cut to Doc Fitch, who stood at the edge of the lot with his hands knotted in his pockets. She needs a bed, the doctor muttered, not loud enough for courage. And laudanum, not a bill of sale. Then you buy her, Doc, the gambler said over his shoulder. Pay with your good intentions. 15. The drover barked, stubborn pride in it now. 17. The gambler's smile went fox-sharp. The auctioneer warmed to his work. 17. That's generosity speaking. Friends. 18. Do I hear 18? Wind came down the street and lifted Rosalie's skirt a breath, stinging grit against her calves. The coyotes called again, longer this time, and she shuddered. She pulled the bundle tighter, pressing her lips to the soft spot on the infant's crown. Hush now, she breathed. Hush, little star. Her eyes, too big for her pale face, skimmed the crowd like a cornered deer's. They never found gentleness, only appraisal. Elias stepped forward at last. not making a show of it, just enough that the boards of the platform carried his weight in their groan. He rested one hand on the rail. "You sell a mare. You don't separate her from her foal," he said conversationally, his voice deep enough to cut through the noise without being raised. "Ought to be the same law for people." The gambler laughed. "You writin' laws now, McKenna? Just know what keeps a creature alive." The auctioneer's smile thinned. "We're at 17. Do I have 18? Let's keep this friendly." A boy who ran errands for the livery crept close to Elias and whispered, "Mister, you fixin' to—" "Never mind, kid." Elias said, eyes still on the woman. He could feel the swallow in his throat, the way the choice in front of him narrowed like a canyon. He'd told himself he had no business collecting strays. He had a broken fence at the north pasture, a black steer gone mule stubborn, hay to put up before first frost. He had a grave on a short hill, and a silence that followed him home like a well-trained dog. 18, the gambler sang, impatient now. Let's be done with this. Rosalie's knees dipped. For a heartbeat, Elias thought she would fold, but she found a post with her free hand and set her shoulder to it. Teeth sunk into her lip. The baby mewed. The sky went from copper to bruised purple at the edges, and the piano inside the saloon hit a sour note, as if the night itself had flinched. Elias inhaled, set his hat back on his head, and let the brim shade his eyes. Then, with the same slow certainty he used to rope a skittish colt, he lifted his hand. Chapter 2, The Unexpected Bid. The silence that followed Elias's raised hand felt heavier than any gunshot. The auctioneer's jaw dropped for half a breath before curling into a triumphant grin. $18 for Mr. Elias McKenna, he called, voice bright with mockery. Fine rancher, fine taste. Do I hear 19? The gambler's smile soured. His boot heel ground against the platform, spur chiming sharp. He looked at Elias as though the man had just kicked his pride clean across the street. "You paying 18 for a broken filly and a squalling pup?" Elias didn't answer. He only adjusted the brim of his hat, steady as bedrock, eyes never leaving Rosalie. Her breath came quick and shallow, and her arms trembled around the bundle. She stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and fear, as though waiting for the trick, waiting for him to laugh and toss her back like spoiled goods. 19? The auctioneer pushed, his voice cracking slightly when no one answered. He scanned the crowd, but men shuffled their boots and looked elsewhere, unwilling to cross a rancher with Elias's reputation. Finally, the gavel came down. Sold to Mr. McKenna. The gambler spat into the dust. "Madman," he muttered. A few onlookers chuckled, but most simply watched with that peculiar hunger small towns had for scandal. Elias ignored them. He walked to the steps of the platform and climbed them, boots thudding heavy. Rosalie shrank back instinctively, pressing her child closer, eyes wide as if he were just another buyer come to claim his due. Elias spoke low, pitched so only she could hear. "I'll not harm you." His hand hovered in the air, not touching, not yet. "Let's get you off the stage." Her lips parted, cracked and pale. Why would you pay for me?" Elias's mouth tightened, and for a long moment he didn't answer. Then he offered his arm, bent at the elbow like a gentleman at a dance. "Because some things ought not be sold." She stared, suspicious, but her legs buckled when she tried to step forward on her own. With a small, reluctant nod, she let his arm steady her. The crowd muttered at the sight, but none stepped close. Elias guided her carefully down the steps, shielding her from the gambler's sneer and the curious stares. "Easy now," he murmured. The wooden street felt endless, every eye on them as he led her to where his horse waited, tethered by the trough. A rangy bay gelding tossed its head, sensing the tension, ears twitching at the sound of distant coyotes calling under the darkening sky. Rosalie stiffened when she saw the saddle. "You'll take me where?" "Home," Elias said simply. He untied the reins and tested the cinch. "My ranch is 5 miles out. You expect me to work?" Her voice trembled, defensive, like a cornered animal. "I expect you to live." He looked at her then, meeting her gaze fully, letting her see the steady calm in his eyes. "Rest. Heal. That's all." Her brow knit, mistrust and bewilderment warring on her pale face. No one had ever bought her for that. Elias swung up into the saddle, the leather creaking. He reached down, offering his hand again. Rosalie hesitated, clutching the baby tighter, the night wind pulling at her hair. Behind them, the saloon piano banged out a careless tune, laughter rolling like thunder, ugly and distant. "Trust me," Elias said, voice rough as gravel but not unkind. At last, she placed her hand in his. He pulled her gently up, steadying her against his chest as she settled sideways before him. The baby whimpered, and Elias adjusted the reins with practiced ease, making space so Rosalie could cradle the child safely. They rode out slow, hooves thudding against the hard-packed earth. The town lights faded behind them, swallowed by the prairie dusk. The coyote's chorus rose again, but now it sounded less like a threat and more like a witness to the strange new beginning taking shape. Rosalie whispered something to the infant, words carried away by the wind. Her body trembled, but little by little, she leaned into the solid strength at her back. Elias kept his gaze on the horizon. The rising stars scattered like sparks across the indigo sky. He didn't know what storms would come, gunmen, whispers, or worse, but for the first time in a long while, the road ahead felt like more than dust and silence. He only tightened his arm protectively around the frail woman and the tiny life she carried, and spurred the horse into the night. Chapter 3. A House Built on Silence. The prairie stretched wide and lonely beneath a rising moon, silver light spilling across the dry grass. By the time Elias guided the bay gelding through the split-rail fence of his ranch, the town was no more than a dim glow behind them. Coyotes had gone quiet, and the only sound was the steady rhythm of hooves and the faint whimper of Rosalie's child. The cabin came into view, small and weathered, its porch slanted but sturdy. A lantern glowed faintly in the window. Elias had left it burning before heading into town, though he hadn't expected to return with company. He swung down first, boots crunching on the dry dirt, then held up his hands. "Take it slow," he said. Rosalie clutched her child tighter and eased herself down, her legs trembling so badly Elias half feared she'd crumple. He steadied her by the elbow. She flinched at his touch, and he let go immediately, stepping back with a nod. "Inside's warmer," he said simply. The cabin smelled faintly of coffee grounds and wood smoke when he opened the door. Rosalie hesitated on the threshold, eyes darting like a trapped bird's, taking the plain wooden table, the cast-iron stove, the bunk against the far wall. It wasn't much, but it was clean. "You can take the bed," Elias said, setting his hat on a peg. "I'll sleep in the loft." Rosalie blinked at him, her lips parting as if to protest. Then she pressed the baby to her chest and shuffled inside. She lowered herself gingerly onto the edge of the bunk. The boards creaked. Elias busied himself with the stove, striking a match and coaxing the fire back to life. Sparks leapt in the dim cabin, and the warmth grew. He filled a tin cup with water from the kettle and set it on the table near her. "You'll need to drink," he said. "Lost too much blood already." Rosalie's fingers trembled as she lifted the cup, her gaze never leaving him. She drank slowly, suspicious, as though waiting for some hidden cruelty. Elias said nothing, only pulled off his gloves and set about cutting slices of bread from a small loaf, laying them on a plate. The silence stretched. Outside, the wind rubbed the shutters, carrying the scent of sagebrush. Somewhere in the distance, a horse stamped in its stall. Finally, Rosalie's voice came soft, brittle. "Why are you doing this?" Elias paused, the knife in his hand catching the firelight. He kept his eyes on the bread, because no one else would. That's not an answer. She rocked the baby gently, her chin trembling. Men don't spend money for nothing. Not out here. Elias set the knife down. For a moment, he looked as though he might leave the words unsaid, but then he turned, leaning his weight against the table. The firelight carved the lines were on his face, the pale scar along his jaw. I had a wife, he said at last. She died when men decided they had more right to her than I did. I buried her on a hill north of here. Since then, I figured I'd not stand by and watch another woman be dragged into the same hell. Rosalie's breath caught. Her eyes softened for a heartbeat, but suspicion crept back quick as a shadow. So you think I should be grateful? No. Elias's voice was steady, unflinching. I don't want your gratitude. I just want you alive. Silence fell again, heavier this time. Rosalie lowered her eyes to the child, brushing her lips over the infant's crown. Her lashes glistened in the firelight. Elias turned back to the stove, ladling beans into a bowl and setting it near her, careful not to crowd her space. He didn't ask if she was hungry. He knew she was. The baby stirred, letting out a thin wail. Rosalie rocked gently, humming a tune so soft Elias could barely hear it over the crackle of the fire. For the first time since town, the tension in her shoulders eased just slightly. Elias leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching the flames lick the stove. He made no move to intrude, no demand, no claim. The cabin filled with the sound of the baby's soft whimpers and Rosalie's tired lullaby. It was not peace, not yet, but it was silence shared, and in the hard country of the West, sometimes that was the first step towards something stronger. Chapter 4, Whispers of the Past. By the time morning spilled gold across the plains, Elias was already outside mending fence posts. The rhythm of hammer and nail echoed in the stillness, mingling with the soft nickering of horses in the corral. Inside the cabin, Rosalie sat on the edge of the bunk, baby swaddled tight, her eyes drifting to the door each time the hammer struck. She had slept little. Every creak of the timbers, every gust of wind rattling the shutters, made her flinch. The safety of walls felt fragile, like paper against fire. When Elias came in, sweat darkening his shirt at the shoulders, he paused at the threshold. His eyes flicked to her, then to the child in her arms. You should eat, he said, setting down a pail of fresh water. I'll bring eggs in a bit. Rosalie nodded faintly, though her gaze was distant. After a long silence, she asked, They'll come, won't they? Elias stilled. He leaned his hat on the table and rubbed a hand across his jaw, the rasp of stubble loud in the quiet. Maybe. Men like that don't give up easy. Rosalie's arms tightened around her baby. Then you shouldn't have brought me here. I don't want her blood on my hands. Elias looked at her then, a steady, unflinching gaze. You didn't put me in this. They did. Don't go carrying blame that isn't yours. Her lips parted, but she said nothing more. That afternoon, 2 of Elias's ranch hands rode in from town, dust rising in long plumes behind their horses. The older one, Cal Dorsey, swung down with a frown etched deep in his leathery face. Word spreading, Cal said, jerking his chin toward the cabin. Gambler Hollis and his boys are riled. They say McKenna stole what was theirs. Elias's jaw worked, though he kept his voice level. She ain't a thing to steal. Cal glanced toward the door, where Rosalie's silhouette moved faintly behind the curtain. Don't matter what's true. Folks will believe Hollis if he says it loud enough. He's already drinking up the saloon, gathering men who like easy coin. The younger hand, Jesse, spat into the dust. They'll come riding, sure as sunrise. Elias's eyes narrowed, scanning the horizon as though the threat might already be cresting the hills. Then we'll be ready. That night, Rosalie stood just outside the cabin, the baby asleep inside. The prairie wind lifted her hair, carrying the dry scent of sagebrush and smoke from the cook fire. She watched Elias check his rifle by lantern light, the metal gleaming as he ran a practiced hand along the barrel. "Is this your life?" she asked suddenly, voice carried by the breeze. "Waiting for men with guns to come for you?" Elias didn't look up. "Life out here's always waiting for something. Drought, storms, wolves. Men are just another kind." She stepped closer, clutching her shawl tight around her. "You shouldn't do this for me. I don't understand why." He finally looked at her, lantern glow painting his face in amber and shadow. "Because I know what it's like to lose someone you should have been able to protect." The words settled heavy between them. Rosalie felt her throat tighten. "Your wife?" she whispered. Elias gave a single nod, buried her 3 winters back. "I couldn't stop what was coming. But this time," he closed the rifle with a snap, "this time I'll stand in the way." Rosalie's breath hitched. Her eyes burned, though no tears fell. She wanted to argue, to push him away before danger swallowed them both. But the steadiness in his voice struck something deep inside her. Behind them, coyotes cried to the moon, sharp and mournful. Rosalie wrapped her arms around herself and shivered, though the night was warm. Elias set the rifle aside and straightened, looking out at the endless sweep of dark prairie. "They'll come soon," he said quietly. "But you won't face them alone." Rosalie said nothing, but for the first time since the auction block, she believed him. Chapter 5, Fire and Gunpowder. The night was too still. Even the horses in the corral shifted uneasily, snorting at the silence. Elias felt in his bones before he heard the sound, the faint rhythm of hooves, masked by distance but steady, purposeful. He rose from the porch chair, rifle already in hand. "Cal," he called low. The older ranch hand stepped from the shadows, shotgun cradled. Jesse, the younger, climbed down from the loft with a lantern, face pale. "They're coming," Elias said simply. The lantern flame trembled in the wind. Out past the fence line, a glimmer of torches appeared, bobbing like wicked stars in the dark. Voices followed, ragged laughter, the metallic clatter of spurs. Inside the cabin, Rosalie startled awake to the baby's faint cry. She pressed him close, heart hammering. Through the window she saw the torches and the faint silhouettes of riders cresting the ridge. Smoke and danger carried on the wind. Her throat went dry. They had come for her. Outside, Hollis's voice rang sharp. "McKenna, hand over the girl, and maybe we won't burn you down with her." Elias stepped forward into the lantern light, his broad frame casting a long shadow across the dirt yard. "She ain't yours to take." A cruel laugh. "You paid coin, same as we tried. Makes her just another prize. But you've got a reputation, Elias, and I figure you care more for cattle than a broken whore. Don't be foolish." Elias leveled the rifle. "Step 1 foot closer, and you'll be fertilizer for the sage." The standoff cracked as quick as lightning. Gunfire ripped through the stillness, bullets sparking off the hitching post. Horses screamed, rearing. Elias dove for cover near the trough, answering with a steady shot that sent one torchbearer tumbling. Cal's shotgun thundered from the porch, scattering the first wave, but more riders pressed forward. One torch landed in the barn hay. Flames licked upward, orange against the dark, heat rushing out in a greedy roar. Inside, smoke rolled through the cabin seams. Rosalie coughed, clutching her baby. She looked at the crib Elias had built with his own hands, the warmth of the bed, the rough safety he'd given her, and something shifted inside her chest. She would not cower while men tried to tear it away. She laid the baby in a wash basin padded with blankets, pushing it beneath the table to shield him from stray shots. Then she grabbed the rifle Elias kept leaning by the hearth. The weight nearly buckled her arms, but she steadied it against her shoulder the way she remembered her father once doing long ago, before her world had collapsed. Rosalie shoved the door open. Smoke curled past her, carrying sparks. The scene before her burned into memory. Elias crouched by the trough, firing methodically, his jaw set hard, eyes bright with a reflection of fire. "Get back inside," he barked when he saw her. Rosalie shook her head, breath ragged. "No." Her voice cracked but carried. "Not again. Not helpless." A rider charged from the side, pistol raised. Rosalie didn't think. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked like a mule, nearly knocking her over, but the bullet struck true. The man's hat flew off as he toppled from the saddle, dust exploding where he hit the ground. Elias's eyes widened, a flash of shock and something deeper. For a moment, he almost faltered, but then his mouth curved, grim, proud. "Good girl," he muttered, and swung his rifle to cover her flank. The fight raged fierce. Hollis cursed and fired wildly, but his men, shaken by resistance and the growing inferno of the barn, began to scatter. Flames roared, embers dancing into the sky like wild spirits. Gunfire echoed one last time before fading into distance, the riders retreating into the night. The silence afterward was broken only by the crackle of fire. Elias stood, chest heaving, lowering his rifle. Cal and Jesse rushed to douse the barn with buckets, but half the structure was already lost. Rosalie swayed where she stood, the rifle slipping from her arms. Elias crossed the yard in 3 strides and caught her before she fell. She clutched at his shirt, breath trembling. I couldn't just sit inside," she whispered against his chest. Elias held her tight, smoke and sweat clinging to them both. "You didn't. You saved me." For a long moment, they stood in the glow of burning wood, hearts pounding in time. The West was cruel, but in the ashes, Elias saw her not as a broken woman to be sheltered, but as a partner who had stood her ground. And Rosalie, leaning against his steady frame, knew she had finally found something worth fighting for. Chapter 6. The Confession Under the Stars. The fire had been beaten back by midnight, leaving the barn half collapsed, black timbers still hissing where water turned embers to smoke. The ranch lay quiet again, though the scent of char clung to everything like a stubborn ghost. Elias stood outside the cabin, sleeves rolled, wiping soot from his hand with a rag that only spread it darker. His shoulders ached, and his ribs throbbed from where a bullet had glanced the trough and splintered wood into him. Still, he stood tall, gaze roaming the horizon as if danger might circle back. The door creaked behind him. Rosalie stepped out, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her baby asleep in the crook of one arm. Her face was pale in the lantern glow, strands of hair loosened by the fight, eyes rimmed red from smoke and strain. "You should be resting," Elias said, voice rough. "I couldn't sleep." She stepped closer, her bare feet whispering against the dirt. "Every time I close my eyes, I hear them, see the fire." Elias looked at her then, and for the first time since the chaos, his hard edges softened. "It's over for tonight. They'll think twice before riding back." Rosalie lowered her gaze to the baby's sleeping face. "I never meant to bring this here. To your land. To you. You didn't bring it," Elias said. "They did." He leaned his rifle against the porch rail, then tipped his hat back, revealing the weary lines around his eyes. "And I'd do it again. Every damn bit of it." She studied him, the way the firelight caught the scar at his jaw, the tired strength in his frame. "Why?" she asked, voice trembling. "Why me?" Elias turned his eyes to the night sky, where stars glittered sharp and endless above the plains. Coyotes sang faintly in the distance, their cries carrying like a hymn. For a long moment, he didn't answer, and Rosalie thought perhaps he wouldn't. Finally, he said quietly, Because I buried one woman already. Watched her life taken by men who thought they had a right. Couldn't save her. But I swore, if I ever had the chance again, I wouldn't stand aside. Rosalie's breath caught. Her hand, trembling, tightened around the child. Your wife. Elias nodded once. His voice thickened, though it didn't waver. 3 winters passed. She had a laugh that could outshine any sunrise. And I failed her. I've lived with that weight every day since. The night air pressed heavy between them. Rosalie's throat ached, her heart twisting with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Not pity, but recognition. And now you think saving me will make it right? Elias's gaze finally found hers, steady and unflinching. No, there's no making that right. But I'll be damned if I let the same darkness swallow you. Or him. His eyes dropped to baby, then back to her. You both deserve more than the world's given. The words settled deep in Rosalie's chest, breaking something fragile that had been locked tight since the auction block. For the first time, she didn't see herself as a burden or a price paid. She saw the truth in his eyes, plain, raw, unadorned. She stepped closer, the shawl slipping from her shoulders, the firelight painting her face in gold and shadow. You don't know me, she whispered. Not really. You don't know what I've done to survive, the shame I carry. Elias reached out then, slow enough she could refuse him. His calloused hand brushed her wrist, steady and warm. Don't need to know all that. What matters is who you are when you stand here, now. And I've seen enough to know you ain't weak. Her lips parted, trembling with unshed tears. For so long she'd been told she was nothing, spoiled, ruined, worthless. Yet this man, with his weathered hands and grief-shadowed eyes, saw something else. Rosalie laid her free hand over his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat beneath. For the first time in years, she whispered, I feel safe. With you. Elias's throat worked, his hand tightening gently around hers. And for the first time since she died, he said low, I feel alive again. The coyote's song faded into silence. Above them, the stars blazed brighter, as if bearing witness. They stood there, close but not yet kissing, not yet breaking the fragile spell. Just 2 souls scarred by loss, bound together under the endless sky. For now, the west was quiet, and for the first time, hope flickered in the dust. Chapter 7, A Place to Belong. The days after the fire carried a strange stillness. Smoke no longer curled above a ranch, but the blackened ribs of the barn stood like skeleton fingers against the prairie sky. Each morning, Elias rose before dawn, hammer in hand, and set about rebuilding. Cal and Jesse stayed on, patching fences and hauling water, but the work stretched endless. Rosalie watched from the porch those first mornings, the baby bundled in her arms. She told herself she had no place among hammer and nails, that her strength was still thin as paper. But something in Elias's steady determination stirred her. He had risked his life to protect her, and here he was again, silent, sweating, shaping broken wood into shelter. On the 3rd morning, she stepped off the porch. I can help, she said softly. Elias glanced up from where he balanced a beam on his shoulder, his brow furrowed, but not in anger. You ought to rest. I've done enough resting, Rosalie said, shifting the baby to one side. I can carry or sweep or anything. Elias studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. All right, there's no shame in lighter work. Start by gathering the smaller boards, stack, and neat. So she did. Her arms ached, but she stacked until her palms blistered. When she paused to catch her breath, Elias's eyes found her across the yard. He didn't smile. He rarely did. But there was a softness in his gaze that steadied her more than any words. In town, gossip swirled like dust devils. Folks at the saloon whispered that Elias McKenna had lost his senses, housing a woman bought at auction and her mewling babe. Some claimed she bewitched him. Others muttered that she'd ruin his ranch. But as the weeks passed, the talk grew quieter. Elias didn't waste breath defending himself. He simply lived, and the ranch lived with him. Rosalie learned to feed the chickens, to stir beans over fire without burning them, to sew patches into Elias's worn shirts. Her laughter, fragile at first, like a foal learning its legs, grew steadier each day. The baby's cries mingled with the sounds of ranch life, hammering horse hooves, coyotes at dusk. One evening, after the sun sank red over plains and painted the sky with dust, Elias returned from the fields to find Rosalie rocking the child on the porch. She hummed softly, her voice carrying on the wind. For a heartbeat, he froze. The sound was simple, untrained, but it touched some long, empty corner of him. "You sing," he said quietly, leaning against the post. Rosalie startled, her cheeks warming. "Only to him," she admitted, nodding to the baby. "You should do it more." His voice was low, almost gruff, but his eyes betrayed something gentler. She looked at him, at the sweat-streaked face, the scars that told of survival, and the silence that clung to him like a cloak. "And who would listen?" she asked softly. "I would." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with more meaning than either dared touch. Rosalie's lips parted, but no reply came. Instead, she lowered her gaze, heart-pounding in a way she hadn't felt in years. By the next week, the barn walls stood taller, and Elias's hands were raw from labor. Rosalie slipped into rhythm beside him, feeding horses, carrying water, hanging laundry to dry in the prairie wind. It wasn't obligation that drove her any more, but choice. One evening, as they shared bread and coffee at the table, Rosalie spoke suddenly. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice steady. "When I first came here, I told myself I'd leave as soon as I could stand on my own. But," she set down her cup, fingers trembling slightly, "I don't want to leave." Elias looked up sharply. His jaw worked, but no words came at first. Rosalie swallowed. "Not out of debt, or because I've nowhere else. I want to stay because when I'm here with you, I feel like I belong somewhere. For the first time in my life." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft hiss of the stove. Elias's eyes held hers, searching, as if he didn't trust his own hearing. Finally, he let out a slow breath, the lines of grief around his mouth easing. "You be welcome here," he said, voice rough but sure. "Not as debt, not as charity. As family." Rosalie's lips trembled into the faintest smile. She reached across the table, her hand brushing his, hesitant but real. His calloused fingers closed gently over hers. For once, Elias didn't look to the horizon or the grave on the hill. He looked only at her. Chapter 8. Sunrise over plains. Dawn crept slow over the wide plains, spilling light across the horizon until the land glowed gold. The prairie grass shimmered with dew, and the air carried that sharp, clean scent that only came after a night of stillness. From the porch of the cabin, the world seemed endless, stretching out into forever. Rosalie stood barefoot on the worn boards, the baby nestled against her chest, wrapped in a quilt she'd mended herself. The child's tiny breaths warmed her collarbone. She gazed across the land, where cattle dotted the pasture like dark stones, and for the first time in memory, her heart didn't tremble at the thought of tomorrow. Behind her, the door creaked. Elias stepped out, a mug of coffee in hand, his broad frame silhouetted by the rising sun. His shirt was rolled at the sleeves, collar open, and his hair was still damp from the basin. He looked tired, as always, but there was a lightness in his eyes now, something that hadn't been of the day he first saw her on the auction block. "Morning," he said, voice low and steady. Rosalie turned, offering him the softest of smiles. "Morning." He came to stand beside her, the porch boards groaning under his boots. For a moment, they simply stood together, watching the prairie wake, the horses tossing their manes, the distant sound of coyotes fading into silence as the sun pushed higher. Rosalie's gaze drifted to Elias, his profile cut sharp against the light. She remembered the way he'd looked that night of fire, the way he had held her up when her knees buckled, the way his voice had carried the weight of a man who'd lost too much but still refused to let go. Her throat tightened. "You ever think," she whispered, "that maybe God gave us a second chance? Out here in the dust and fire." Elias set the mug on the rail, his hands rough and scarred, yet careful as he reached to brush a loose strand of hair from her face. His touch lingered for a heartbeat longer than it needed to. "I reckon I don't know what God's plans are," he said, "but I know what I see when I look at you." Rosalie's breath caught. "And what do you see?" He held her gaze, unflinching. "A woman stronger than any storm I've known. A mother who'd walk through fire for her child. And someone his voice faltered for just a moment, the vulnerability raw. Someone I want beside me, come what may." Her eyes filled, but these weren't the tears of fear or shame that had haunted her before. They were tears born of release, of something new breaking free. She shifted the baby gently, freeing one hand to lay against his chest. The steady thud of his heart met her palm. "I was sold like cattle," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Bleeding, broken, and worth less than the dirt under their boots. I thought I'd never be more than that. But you—" She swallowed hard, her hand curling into his shirt. "You never treated me as something to own. You gave me back my life." Elias's jaw tightened, and he bent his head close. "No, Rosalie, you took it back. I just gave you a place to stand." The words wrapped around her like warmth against the morning chill. For a long moment, they stood in silence, watching the sun climb higher, painting the plains with fire and promise. The baby stirred, a soft whimper, and Elias reached out without hesitation, his big hand steady as she passed the child into his arms. The sight, this hardened rancher holding her son with such quiet reverence, brought Rosalie's heart to its knees. "Guess we both got someone to protect now," Elias murmured, rocking the child gently. Rosalie stepped close, their shoulders touching, the three of them framed by the endless dawn. She let her head rest against his arm, closing her eyes. For the first time since she could remember, she wasn't waiting for the world to take something from her. She was standing at the edge of a new life, not as a possession, not as a shadow, but as a woman who had chosen her place. And as the sun broke fully over the plains, Elias glanced down at her, his lips curving into faintest, most honest smile she'd ever seen. The West was still dangerous, still cruel, but here, on this patch of earth, love had carved out a home. The barn had been rebuilt, its new boards pale against the charred remains of what once burned. Horses shifted in their stalls, their soft knickers a promise of steady work and life ahead. Rosalie stood at the porch rail, the child in her arms now heavier, stronger, eyes wide to the fading light. She turned as Elias came up from the corral, dust on his boots, hat in hand, his face softened by the setting sun. He stopped before her, gaze resting first on the child, then lifting to her. "I bought you that night," he said, voice low and rough, "but truth is, you saved me." Her throat tightened. She reached for his hand, their fingers twining as natural as breath. "And you gave me more than freedom, Elias. You gave me a home." The world seemed to pause, wind, horses, music all blending into a quiet heartbeat, as he bent and pressed his forehead to hers. "Then let's never let it go," he whispered. Together they stood, three souls framed against the blazing horizon, their shadows stretching long across the dust. The West was still dangerous, still untamed, but for them, it had finally become a place to belong.